At our lowest point, my boyfriend and I lived in a tunnel under a bridge, even resorting to scavenging through garbage. Later, he courageously rescued a girl from her abusive boyfriend, but during the confrontation, he was injured and taken to the hospital. The aggressor was extremely wealthy, and with the compensation money we received, we gradually climbed into high society. Just when we were about to get married, the same girl he had saved unexpectedly appeared, disrupting our wedding. Security tried to remove her, but my boyfriend intervened, stopping them. The ceremony continued, but I couldn't ignore how his eyes kept drifting toward the tearful girl in the audience. 5 years after the wedding, he began bringing up divorce frequently. The last time he mentioned it, I finally agreed. Today is New Year's Eve. As I scrolled through WeChat, it was clear that GNZ wouldn't be returning. People used to say that the most foolish woman is the one who sticks with a man through his toughest times, only to be discarded once he succeeds. I once believed GNZ was an exception, but over time, he only proved the saying true. Without hesitation, I deleted his WeChat contact and signed the divorce agreement left on the coffee table. Just as I finished signing, I heard the door open. Looking up, I saw Hira clinging closely to GNZ's arm. She was the same girl he had saved 5 years earlier. Since that moment, GNZ had changed completely. He no longer cared about me. Even when Isha tried to claim her place by his side, GNC had looked at her with red eyes and told her that he only married me because I had cared for him during his hospital stays and helped build his fortune. If it weren't for those reasons, he wouldn't have chosen to marry me. I wasn't sure how many people had heard those words before they finally reached me. But I seemed to be the last one to learn how he truly felt. This morning, when he once again mentioned divorce, I agreed without resistance. As Gians knelt down to grab a pair of plush slippers from the shoe cabinet, he gently placed them at Hira's feet. She rested her hand naturally on his waist as he changed his shoes, and they looked more like a family than we ever did. Still, the pain of being treated like I was invisible all these years stung deeply. Taking a deep breath, I called out, "GNC, I need to talk to you." He didn't respond, his hands still busy with his shoes. Hushu, who stood nearby, smirked at me and nudged GNC, whispering, "Wei is waiting for you." Finally, he turned his head, his earlier tenderness replaced by cold indifference. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. I stole a glance at Huasa behind him and lowered my voice. "I want to speak with you alone." Before I could continue, he cut me off, sounding impatient. "Whatever it is, you can say it here. Xia isn't a stranger." Kiru's cheeks flushed red at his words, and she playfully slapped his arm with a light giggle. Watching their flirtatious interaction was unbearable, so I simply pushed the signed divorce agreement across the coffee table toward him. Upon seeing the document, GNZ's expression darkened. "Is this another one of your games?" For a moment I froze, remembering the previous month on our wedding anniversary. He had posted a photo on social media, seemingly on a tropical vacation with Hua. They were both smiling in the picture, a happiness I had never seen during our marriage. Out of anger, I sent him a sarcastic message, pretending to agree to the divorce. He was so thrilled that he didn't even question the message's sincerity, returning to China that same night with legal documents in hand. Now, however, I gave a half-hearted smile and pushed the papers toward him again. "This time it's real. We're done," GN said. He remained still, his sharp gaze fixed on me as though trying to read my mind. Without a word, Kashua stepped forward, picked up the papers, and examined them closely. Pointing to the section outlining asset distribution, she sneered. "Why is the property split evenly? I thought you didn't contribute much to the company after your marriage." Her words stung, but what hurt more was that GNC said nothing to stop her. My heart sank. I straightened and replied coldly, "This is a matter between my husband and me." "Since when do you have a say in it?" Tears welled in her eyes as she set the papers back on the table. "I was just asking a question. No need to get so hostile," she said in a trembling voice. Seeing her cry, GNZ immediately pulled her into his arms, scolding me. "Shen Hu, what's wrong with you? She only asked one thing, and you're already acting like this." I wanted to argue back, to explain how inappropriate her behavior was, but my voice caught in my throat. Watching how protective he was of her, I remembered how he used to care for me in the past. There was a time when even the smallest scratch on my hand would leave him heartbroken for days. But now that tenderness had shifted to someone else, I wasn't sure when things had changed so drastically between us, or why. I composed myself and handed the divorce papers across the table. "I've been with you for so many years. The asset division in this agreement is fair." Distracted, GNZ brushed my hand aside, knocking the documents to the floor. "I don't want to discuss this today." Hushu, still clinging to his arm, instantly pouted, her voice soft yet accusing. "Why not? She's already signed it. Isn't this what you've always wanted?" "Yes, hasn't this been your goal all along? Why not settle it now?" I added firmly. Lowering his head, GNC gently comforted her, his voice filled with tenderness. "Have you forgotten why we came back?" She shook her head, whispering she hadn't forgotten, and urged him to leave quickly. As he headed toward the stairs, it became clear why they had returned, to retrieve their passports for another trip abroad, just like last year. The only difference this time was that I wouldn't be left behind. Once Jianse was out of sight, Hushu glanced at the untouched meal on the table before turning back to me with a smug look. Her gentle demeanor had completely disappeared. "Sister Wei Yi," she said with a falsely apologetic smile, "I'm really sorry, but Yanzi insisted on taking me on this trip abroad. I couldn't refuse him. You've been married for so long, and yet he's never taken you on a trip, has he?" I stayed silent, so she raised her hand, flashing a ring on her index finger. "Look at this. Yanzi gave me this ring. I told him I didn't even like it, but he insisted on buying it for me." Emeralds this size are rare these days. Hearing her brag, I felt a surge of irritation and interrupted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Indeed, few people are capable of repaying kindness with betrayal. Her smile faltered briefly. But before I could savor the moment, Jianzid's angry voice echoed from the stairs. "Shen Yu, shut up!" He stormed over, placing himself protectively between us and pulling Hushu behind him. "I've told you many times not to bully her. Can't you understand that? I've barely been gone, and you're already starting again." His tone was sharp, his eyes filled with disappointment. Defensively, I replied, "How am I bullying her?" Before I could finish, Kirisha tugged gently on his sleeve, speaking sweetly. "I'm fine. We should leave now, or we'll miss our flight." Her triumphant gaze met mine, as if daring me to argue further. She knew whatever I said, GNZ wouldn't believe me. Satisfied, GNZ's anger eased, and they walked out together, hand in hand. Just before the door shut, I overheard Kirisha ask softly, "Why didn't you sign it?" Aren't you worried she'll change her mind? Jianzi's reply was calm. Be good. It's New Year's Eve. Let's not spoil the mood with unpleasant conversations. As the door closed, bitterness lingered in my chest. It had taken us 7 years to go from having nothing to reaching a life of luxury where money flowed easily. Throughout that time, he had always insisted I focus on my health, while he managed all business matters. Gradually, he took over everything, and I had been left as a powerless figurehead. This was also why I resisted the idea of a divorce. Why should I step aside when I had sacrificed so much? If GNC was determined to hand everything to Hushu, I would do everything in my power to prevent it. The next morning, I booked a flight to Pingjing. I had dreamed of visiting for a long time. In my youth, I lacked the money. When I finally had wealth, I lacked companionship. I rented a small place there. On clear days, I could see the snow-capped mountains in the distance. My landlord, Lin Su, was about my age and always spoke with a warm, calm demeanor. Most of his properties were in remote areas, and since it was the off-season, I was his only tenant. When I mentioned my plans to climb the mountains, he advised me that a recent snowstorm had closed the hiking trails, and I'd have to wait for conditions to improve. I was disappointed, having prepared for months. However, he reassured me, if you're not in a hurry, there are plenty of other beautiful spots to explore nearby. I truly had no urgent matters to tend to. My career no longer required my attention, and my husband was already with someone else. That first evening, we stood by the door, quietly watching the snowfall. Embarrassed, I eventually asked if he could help me find a trustworthy mountain guide, even if it cost more than usual. Lin Su thought for a moment, then nodded, taking out his phone and scrolling through his contacts. At that moment, my own phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from my service provider about an overdue payment. After settling the bill, 3 new messages from G. Enza appeared. The first read, "Why did you delete me on WeChat?" The second instructed, "Go to the drawer in the study, find the black folder and send me a photo of the contents." The last was a demand. "Where are you? Stop pretending you can't see my messages." Without a second thought, I deleted all 3 texts and blocked his number, unwilling to let his presence disturb my peace. I stayed in Pingjing for half a month. The hiking trails finally reopened, and Lin Su became my guide for the climb. Over the past 2 weeks, he had shown me around the local area, pointing out all the scenic spots worth visiting. I offered to pay him for his help, but Lin Su shook his head, politely declining the money. He was indeed very considerate, but calling him a gentleman alone didn't seem quite enough. He lacked the typical flaws seen in most men. His calm demeanor, respectful nature, and kindness made him seem almost perfect, embodying the ideals many women imagine in a dream partner. The night before our hike, Lin Su still hadn't recommended a guide for me. That evening, we were watching a variety show together in the living room while having dinner. Impatient, I finally asked him directly about the guide situation. Without a word, Lin Su took out 2 guider certificates and placed them in front of me. Then, glancing toward the equipment stacked in the corner, he said, "I'll be your guide tomorrow." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang outside the courtyard. Lin Su set down his bowl and went to answer it. A group of men entered, supporting 2 figures between them. As they came closer, I froze. The chicken leg in my hand suspended mid-air. Wasn't that GNC and Hua? Why were they here? The moment Hua spotted me, his face stiffened. and his fingers clutched the hem of his shirt nervously. Wei Yi, why are you here? Jianze's reaction was similar. He hesitated, his face betraying a mixture of shock, anger, and discomfort. His silence only made his emotions more obvious, with the slight sneer curling at the corner of his mouth, making him look even more unpleasant. Feigning calmness, I crossed my legs and casually placed the chicken leg back into my bowl, giving them a confused look. Who are you? Lin Su, equally puzzled, turned to one of the men who had entered. Chinu, what's going on here? A man standing beside GNC cleared his throat. We were hired for a guide job. Since we heard you recently accepted a guiding task, we thought we'd team up. Sugu's team has a high success rate, so we decided to follow along. Hearing this, I exhaled in relief, though a part of me remained skeptical. I glanced at the crowd behind Jianzhe and Hua, then asked, why do two people need 6 guides? Before Jianzhe could respond, Hua quickly spoke up, his voice cheerful. Yanzi was worried something might happen to me on the climb, so he hired extra guides for my safety. Besides, we brought a lot of gear, so someone needs to help carry it all, right? Kirisha clung to Jianzi's shoulder, her eyes full of adoration, oblivious to how his gaze lingered on me the entire time. His protective stance toward her was clear, but for the first time, I felt no sting of bitterness. I simply nodded, no longer feeling bothered by his actions as I once had. That night, while packing my equipment in my room, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Lin Su stood there with a warm smile, holding a raincoat in his hands. I noticed you didn't have this in your gear. The weather on the mountain can change suddenly, so you'll need it, he explained. Feeling slightly embarrassed about my oversight, I accepted the raincoat and thanked him sincerely for his thoughtfulness. However, not long after Lin Su left, there was another knock. Assuming he had returned, I opened the door only to find GNZ standing there. My face instantly hardened, and I began closing the door, but he pushed it open with his knee and locked it behind him. Alarmed by his sudden intrusion, I instinctively stepped back, but before I could react, he grabbed my shoulders and pressed me against the wall. His grip was firm and his face was cold, his sharp eyes fixed on me. For half a month, you ignored me. You blocked me everywhere. WeChat, messages. I called, but your phone was constantly busy. And now you're here, living with a man, sharing meals. What's next? Bathing together? Sleeping together? I blinked, almost laughing at the absurdity of his accusations. Are you seriously implying I need to live by your standards of marriage, Mr. G? You seem to have forgotten. We're divorced. There's nothing between Lin Su and me. He's my landlord, and I'm his tenant. We're just being polite. Do you assume everyone behaves like you? Stop making people uncomfortable. His expression grew darker, but I refused to let his hostility affect me. I met his glare head-on and added, You waited 5 years for this divorce. I signed the papers. What more do you want from me? Do you need to push me to my breaking point to be satisfied? Suddenly, his grip loosened, and his anger seemed to dissolve. He turned his face away, unwilling to meet my eyes. I rubbed my sore shoulder, feeling both frustrated and helpless. His voice, softer now, broke the silence. I never wanted anything bad to happen to you. I've told you this so many times. I thought back to the time he had been in danger, the memory still clear. He had lain in the ICU, his condition critical, with medical bills costing as much as 20,000 yuan daily. For us, living in a damp, cramped basement. That amount was impossible. Not long after, the court ruled in our favor, ordering the wealthy second-generation heir responsible for his injury to pay 3.63 million yuan in compensation, including ongoing nutritional subsidies. Back then, Jianse barely had half an hour of clarity each day. When he regained enough awareness to learn about the settlement, his reaction was unexpected. He refused the food I offered, weakly pushing it away and attempting to make sounds, seemingly urging me to leave. I understood his message clearly. 3.63 million yuan was more than what most people could earn in a lifetime. At the time, I believed his intention was for me to use that money to live comfortably and never spend a cent on him. But I refused to abandon him. When I reached for the bank card to pay the hospital bill, Jianse suddenly knocked over the bowl of congee on the table, glaring at me. Shen Hu, why are you being so difficult? Who asked you to get involved? I don't love you anymore. Take the money and leave. Despite his daily attempts to push me away, I stayed by his side and never gave up on him. On the day he was discharged from the hospital, he could only sit in a wheelchair. As the long-lost sunlight touched his face, tears welled up in his eyes. Outside the hospital doors, he gripped my hand tightly and said with rare sincerity, "Shenhua, we must be happy from now on." But 5 years into our marriage, he changed. His mood became volatile, and exhaustion replaced his warmth. In his efforts to push for divorce, he treated me with cold indifference and even said cruel things. Though I had tried to hold on, he repeatedly cut me off with heartless words. Now, hearing that he supposedly wished me well felt almost unbelievable. Gathering my thoughts, I stared at him and said coldly, "Please leave my room immediately." A knock sounded at the door, and Lin Su's gentle voice called out, "We're almost ready to leave." I responded with a calm, "Okay," grabbed my prepared gear, and walked past Jianze without another glance. This was the first climbing group since the trail reopened. The mountain weather was unpredictable, and even Lin Su, with his experience, couldn't guarantee safety. The worst-case scenario was turning back halfway. Not long after we began the hike, Hushu started complaining, asking for breaks frequently. Though the guides had initially been patient, their expressions turned increasingly helpless as they lit cigarettes and stared at the scenery while waiting. Finally, Jian Sen, who had remained quiet, looked at her with an uncharacteristically stern face. His voice was calm, but clearly irritated. "If you can't continue, we should turn back now." Hushu's face contorted as tears welled up. "No, I won't go back." I kept close behind Lin Su. And as he noticed Hushu lagging far behind, he radioed Chinu, asking him to offer her extra pay to rent a horse so she wouldn't hold up the group. Then, pausing, he turned to me with a questioning glance. I shook my head, indicating I didn't need one. I had spent half a year preparing for this climb, practicing with stair runs and jogging. Although a bit breathless, it was still manageable for me. The pace increased as the horse packers arrived with their animals, and we continued forward. Gradually, my body adjusted to the altitude, and I was able to keep up with the group more easily. After nearly 4 hours of trekking, we finally arrived at the base camp. Beyond this point, horses could no longer proceed. Hushu slumped onto a large stone, looking pale. She complained of dizziness, needing oxygen frequently, and claimed her legs were in pain. I kindly suggested, "If you're feeling unwell, you can turn back now. You can still ride a horse from here." Upon hearing this, her expression twisted into defiance, and she snapped, "I know what you're trying to imply, but I'm not going back." The manic gleam in her eyes made it clear she was beyond reasoning. Since she had hired 6 guides, the worst that could happen would be them taking turns carrying her up the slope. After dinner, Lin Su went over the safety guidelines and important reminders. Near the end, however, Hushu's patience snapped, and she interrupted with frustration. "What's the point of all these precautions? I paid for this many guides just to reach the summit. If I can't make it to the top, then what's the point of spending so much money?" As she spoke, I glanced at GNZ. He remained silent, his head lowered, tapping his fingers against his knee rhythmically. I recognized this sign of repressed irritation. After being with him for so many years, I knew his body language well. It wouldn't take much to ignite his anger. Lin Su chose to ignore her tantrum and calmly finished his instructions. Then he approached me quietly, reminding me to get some rest since we'd be starting the climb at 3 a.m. after breakfast. The next morning, as I checked my gear, I noticed a significant amount of my oxygen supply and energy bars were missing, nearly a third of what I had packed. My eyes shifted toward Hushu's bag, which looked unusually full compared to before. I stepped forward and grabbed her wrist gently. "Return my supplies." She widened her eyes, feigning innocence. "Sis Wei, why are you being unreasonable? When have I ever taken anything from you? I know you dislike me, but you can't accuse me unfairly." I wasn't buying her act. "Then let me check. If you're innocent, you won't mind proving it, right?" Clearly trying to avoid confrontation, she handed her bag to the guide behind her. "Why should I let you inspect it? I already told you I didn't take anything." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep calm. "All my supplies are labeled. If you're telling the truth, you shouldn't have any problem opening it for verification." The noise must have caught attention because GNZ approached, his face already dark with displeasure. His gaze shifted from me to Hushu's pack, and after a brief moment, he spoke, siding with her. "She didn't take anything. I gave her the supplies myself." The implication was obvious. He was suggesting I had falsely accused her of stealing. I shifted my gaze toward his backpack, noting how GNZ's bag was still fully packed, untouched, and unchanged. I hadn't anticipated him siding with her so completely. Without oxygen and energy bars, I would be in serious danger if I continued to the summit. He knew this, but still chose to protect Hushu. Furious, my entire body trembled with anger. I couldn't hold back and delivered 2 loud slaps across Kirua's face. She stood frozen in shock, momentarily too stunned to cry. Then, snapping back to reality, she lunged at me, and we began fighting. I refused to back down, grabbing her by the waist and forcefully throwing her to the ground. The altercation happened so suddenly that no one had time to react before she hit the ground hard. The 6 guides, already frustrated with her antics, exchanged glances and began making excuses to leave the scene, clearly fed up. Just as I raised my foot, ready to step on her, Jianze rushed forward and shielded her, taking the blow instead. I had used all my strength in that kick, and even he couldn't suppress a pained grunt from the impact. In the end, I never made it to the mountain's summit because Hua had called the police. Now I sat calmly at the station, sipping hot tea as the officers questioned us. GNC stood nearby, frowning as he explained the situation while Hua exaggerated every detail. A younger officer warned her not to interrupt the documentation process, and she reluctantly fell silent. Once she had finished giving her statement, she tried to speak again, but the younger officer cut her off with a sharp question. So, miss, what exactly is your relationship with Mr. G? Are you his girlfriend, his sister, or his legal wife? For years, Kirua had been unable to obtain the title of Mrs. G. Legally, since Jianze hadn't signed the divorce papers, I was still his wife. She clearly wouldn't admit to being a mistress, nor would she confess to being the third party. Her awkward silence said everything. The senior officer at the desk shifted the subject, likely sensing the tension. I remained silent throughout, simply asking for refills of hot tea, calm and composed. When GNZ finally expressed his decision not to press charges, Kirua's face turned red with frustration. Why should we just let it go? She was the one who started it, she argued. Annoyed, GNC interrupted her sharply. I said I wouldn't pursue this further. It's over. Stop bringing it up. Since our encounter in Pingjing, he seemed like a changed man. I didn't care to explore the reasons behind his behavior. After we left the station, Jianse caught up with me, grabbing my wrist forcefully before pushing me into his car. The door slammed shut, muffling Kirua's angry shouts from behind. The drive from Pingjing back to Hing took nearly 5 hours, the silence between us tense and suffocating. At some point, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Lin Su. Coming home for dinner tonight? I knew I wouldn't be able to make it, and was about to reply when GNC snatched the phone from my hand. His grip tightened as he stared at the screen, his face twisting in anger. So this is why you want a divorce? Because of him? Suppressing my growing frustration, I took a deep breath and kept my voice steady. I need you to answer a few questions honestly. When he remained silent, I continued. Your silence means you're agreeing. Do you want a divorce? He hesitated for a moment before nodding, clearly reluctant to admit it. Over the years, each time you mentioned divorce, did I ever try to stop you? His expression shifted, his composure faltering slightly, as if he was beginning to feel uncertain. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for now. So, why are you acting dissatisfied again? Jianze pressed his lips together tightly, his thin lips trembling slightly. His eyes revealed a mixture of regret and helplessness. After a long silence, his voice dropped to a pleading whisper. Don't divorce me, please, I'm begging you. I stared at him in disbelief. These words felt so out of place, so unlike him. I was wrong. I've made mistakes all these years. I admit that. Please don't leave me. I'll cut all ties with her, I swear. From now on, I just want to live peacefully with you. His desperate words echoed eerily in my mind, reminding me of the day he was discharged from the hospital. Back then, he had promised to change too. But soon after, Hushu had inserted herself into his life again. She approached him under the pretense of gratitude. At first, I had thought nothing of it. Trust was essential in a relationship. However, as they began meeting more often, and their bond grew suspiciously close, it became impossible to ignore. That was when I realized her motives weren't innocent. In a desperate attempt to hold on to my marriage, I had chosen to use the wedding to solidify my relationship with GNZ. But on the day of the ceremony, Hushu turned everything upside down. She had shown up at my wedding wearing a bridal gown. The moment I saw her, my heart felt like it was going to stop. I was terrified that GNC would let go of my hand right there in front of everyone. Security had eventually escorted her out. But shockingly, she still managed to remain at the banquet, sitting among the guests as if nothing had happened. And when the officiant read our vows, GNC's attention was no longer on me. At that time, both of us were at the height of our careers. We were both orphans, so most of the guests at the wedding were colleagues and friends from work. Nearly everyone had witnessed my humiliation that day, and Hushu's shameless spectacle. After the wedding, their interactions only increased, making me feel more and more uneasy. My frustration grew, and I began arguing with GN Sid, hoping he would understand. But instead, he kept pushing me further away. I poured the tea he had just brought into the pot, boiled it, then poured it straight down the drain. Afterward, I shredded the suit he had planned to wear for his meeting the next day and smashed everything in the house that could be broken. He stared at me, demanding, "How did you turn into this person? When did you become so unworthy of being my wife?" But I remembered all too well. During the hardest period of our lives, he had shouted his promise to the sea, vowing he would marry me and buy me the largest, most radiant diamond ring in the world. Now, as I unraveled before him, his face showed nothing but contempt, empty of the tenderness he once had. "Can't you be more thoughtful, like Hushu? I come home exhausted every day. Why can't you be more understanding?" he snapped. For 5 years, this was the life I endured. I even learned the true reason he married me from the whispers of celebrities at a banquet. Look at her. She looks so worn out. No wonder President G didn't want her as his dance partner. He and Miss Hua are such a perfect match. She's nothing compared to her. I don't get it either. If it weren't for the fact she supported him all those years, people would have talked if they separated. He had no choice but to marry her. Hearing those words made me feel as if the ground had been pulled from under me. I couldn't let it go, so I demanded the truth from him when I got home. At first, he pulled his tie loose impatiently and asked coldly, "Now that you know, do you want a divorce?" Then, as if it meant nothing, he pulled out a divorce agreement from the drawer and slammed it onto the table. "If that's how you feel, just sign it." From that night on, I stopped fighting. I felt nothing anymore. But I wasn't about to let him and Hushu walk away so easily. A plan for revenge slowly began to form in my mind. Now, as I looked into GNC's eager eyes, a sudden laugh escaped my lips. "Fine. But I have 2 conditions." From that day, the dynamic between us shifted. The power he once held seemed to slip through his fingers. Once, he would ask me to prepare a cup of warm milk before bed each night. Now, he was the one leaving a glass of hot milk on my bedside table. When I noticed the nervous, almost servile smile on his face, I gave him a cold glance and smirked. "I'm actually lactose intolerant." His expression changed instantly, guilt flashing across his face. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I'll be more careful next time." I tilted my head, my smile deepening. "You're mistaken. It was Hushu who enjoyed warm milk before bed, not me." After that night, no dairy products ever appeared in our home again. Meanwhile, Linsu contacted me to ask what I wanted to do with the luggage I had left behind in Pingjing. After thinking about it for half an hour, I decided to transfer the rent for a full year and keep the room. I knew I would return eventually, to finish what had been left unresolved. Seated on the sofa, I reached for a cigarette. But just as I was about to light it, the doorbell rang. I slipped the cigarette between my lips and checked the peephole. Seeing the visitor outside, I leaned casually against the doorframe, smirking. "That was fast. I thought no one wanted to take you back to Hing." Kirua shot me a glare before barging inside, ignoring me completely. "Jian sir, how could you leave just like that?" she shouted. But when she caught sight of him, working in the kitchen, Her voice trailed off in confusion. Since our marriage, Jianze hadn't stepped foot in the kitchen. Not once. I lit my cigarette and took a slow drag, watching them both with amusement. GNC finished plating the dishes and brought them to the table, his expression instantly turning cold the moment he saw her. "What are you doing here? Didn't I make myself clear? Stop coming around and disturbing my wife and me." Kirua froze, as though the words physically hit her. This was a side of GNZ she had never seen before. She stared in shock for a moment before resorting to her old tricks, her eyes welling up with tears. Seeing her tear up so dramatically, I couldn't help but scoff. Are tears really such a universal weapon? If tears alone could solve problems, failure would no longer exist. GNZ's face hardened. "Stop using your tears to manipulate me." Her performance was flawless. Tears sparkling at the corners of her eyes. Her nose reddened just enough. She looked so pitiful. Even I almost felt sympathy for her. I exhaled another stream of smoke, tapping my temple playfully. "Oh, I get it. You're here to repay the money, aren't you?" Kirua's teary expression shifted to blank confusion. "What money?" I didn't bother answering. Her reaction told me everything. I knew GNC had once again shielded her. Back in the car that day, I had made two simple demands of him. First, he was to sever all ties with Hushu completely and permanently. Second, I wanted her to return every cent he had given her. The red envelopes of cash, the jewelry, and the luxury gifts he had spoiled her with during holidays. He had agreed without hesitation back then. But now, his guilty expression and the way he avoided my gaze told me he hadn't followed through. The truth was, Kirua hadn't worked for years and had become entirely dependent on GNZ's financial support. She had no income of her own. When I turned my attention back to GNZ, he stammered. I hadn't had a chance to tell her yet. It wasn't intentional. I stubbed out my cigarette and knelt under the coffee table, retrieving the divorce agreement from before. Placing it back on the surface, I leaned back on the sofa with an air of authority and stared directly at GNC. "You remember, don't you? That conversation we had in the car, it was your last chance. If you don't value it, you can't blame me for being heartless. Sign it." The scene felt eerily familiar, mirroring all those past moments when he had relentlessly pressured me for a divorce. But this time, the panic in his eyes was real. He removed his apron, stepping toward me with a tremor in his voice. "Are you truly refusing to give me another chance?" Kirua, noticing his hesitation, seemed to think there was still hope for reconciliation. Her tears from moments earlier had vanished, and she snapped, "Sign it already! Who even cares about you?" GNC ignored her completely, his focus entirely on me. I could tell that if I gave him even the smallest glimmer of hope, he would cling to it and refuse to sign. But my mind was made up. I wasn't backing down. Seeing my unwavering determination, his face crumpled, and the tears he had been holding back finally spilled over. Yet, with visible pain, he signed his name on the papers, one letter at a time. Once the agreement was complete, I stood, picked up the documents, and headed upstairs to start packing my clothes. The terms were clear. I was the one who had to leave the house. As I descended the stairs, dragging my luggage behind me, GNC blocked my path. "You stay, I'll go." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out, his back rigid. Kirua glared at me bitterly before rushing after him. Moments later, the sound of a car engine echoed from outside, and the house fell silent once again. The moment I stepped out of the Civil Affairs office, An overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. The burden I had carried for so long was finally lifted. GNZ appeared to have something more to say. But before he could speak, a car pulled up in front of me. It was Lin Su. The day before, I had messaged him on WeChat, mentioning I needed to catch a flight to Pingjing. He had offered to drive all the way to Hing to pick me up. I had joked that his homestay services were impressive, even including personal pickups. His only response had been a simple "noted." As I approached the car, GNC finally gathered the courage to speak. "I'm sorry." It was just 3 short words. Apologies for the woman who had once shared his struggles in a cramped basement, living a life of frugality alongside him. But those words weren't meant for the person I had become today, and I couldn't accept his apology on behalf of the version of me from 5 years ago, because he owed her far too much. Upon arriving back in Pingjing, Lin Su asked softly, "Do you still want to go back to the snowy mountain?" Staring out the window at the landscape, I nodded firmly. "The trail is still closed for another month," he continued. "But once it reopens, I'll be your guide again." I nodded again, grateful. Before we left, a familiar figure appeared at Lin Su's homestay. It was Yenon, a mutual friend of GNZ and me. He looked surprised when he saw me but nodded politely, offering a half smile. "Are you also climbing with Lin?" "Yes," I replied simply. "How have you been lately?" he asked. "Quite well," I answered, keeping my tone light. After a brief pause, he added quietly, "GNC hasn't been doing well." I didn't react at first, then realized what he meant. With a sarcastic smile, I replied, "How can that be? He got the girl he wanted, didn't he?" Yenon ignored my sarcasm and continued, "Since you left, several key partners have terminated their contracts, and the company's stock price has plummeted. The losses have been massive. Kashua can't help him. She's too focused on fame. Their relationship is strained, and neither seems willing to back down." None of this surprised me. During our early collaborations, I had accompanied GNC to countless business meetings, even drinking until I vomited, once so severely that I suffered stomach bleeding. Would someone like Kashua have that level of dedication? Even if she did, her arrogant attitude had already offended many former partners. Back when she had GNZ's support, she treated them with blatant disrespect, never considering the consequences. Yenon kept talking about GNZ's struggles, but I had already understood enough. Cutting him off, I stated plainly, "We're divorced. Our assets were divided equally from the start. If he's short on cash, he can sell those houses in the suburbs. I'm not obligated to help. Everything in my account now is what I rightfully deserve. So don't ask me for favors on his behalf." My words silenced him completely. Yenon didn't speak to me again for the remainder of the trip. And honestly, it didn't matter. I had no intention of crossing paths with GNZ again. Some things were better left unsaid. While hiking, I accidentally twisted my ankle. Lin Su immediately noticed my discomfort and asked with concern, "Should we keep going?" Looking up at the towering snow-covered peaks, I clenched my jaw and nodded. "I'll manage." His eyes lingered on me for a long moment before he exhaled quietly. "All right, I'll support you." Reaching the summit was far more challenging than expected. The freezing wind bit up my face, and the thin air made every step heavier. When we finally reached the peak, Lin Su hung the summit medal around my neck and snapped a photo of me against the breathtaking view. The descent, however, proved even more difficult, especially with my injured leg. Several times, I nearly lost my balance, But Lin Su was always there to catch me. In the end, he carried me the rest of the way down the mountain. Back at the homestay, he frowned deeply as he brought out a bottle of medicinal wine to treat my swollen ankle. Gently rubbing the ointment into my skin, he scolded. "Shen Hu, you're far too stubborn. Your leg is this swollen, yet you still insisted on reaching the top." I shrugged, brushing it off. "I couldn't quit halfway, could I?" His hands were warm as he carefully worked the swelling. "You're too strong-willed. Have you ever considered finding someone you can lean on?" At those words, a memory of past failures resurfaced. It's better to depend on yourself than to place trust in others. You're the only one you can truly count on. Lin Su twisted the cap back onto the bottle of medicinal wine, avoiding my gaze for a moment before speaking. "In fact, you can lean on me. I won't let you down." Years ago, those words would have left Shen Hu flustered for days. But now, at 27, I had endured too many disappointments, betrayals, and heartbreaks. There were moments when I even questioned if misfortune just followed me. Over time, though, I realized it wasn't bad luck. The truth was simpler. The people I had placed my trust in simply weren't reliable. Lin Su seemed to be waiting patiently for a response. I turned my attention to the pale moonlight stretching across the ground and spoke softly. "Let's not rush these conversations. Time will reveal all the answers."